Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on Lake George Radio, 93.5 FM, and live streaming at lakegeorgeradio.com. Here's local historian Bruce Venter.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bruce Venter. I am a trustee of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, and we're here today with George Bray III. He is an historian, he is a reenactor, he is a collector of items related to colonial America and specifically the French and Indian War. Last week he spoke at Fort William Henry Conference Center on Lieutenant Colonel George Munro. He's here to talk a little bit more on that subject. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Colonel Munro?
Well, Colonel Munro is of Scott descent. Going through the ranks, he gets to Lieutenant Colonel before he dies here in North America. Unlike the movie Last of the Mohegans or the book where the daughters come to visit him, he had 3 children according to a will dated in 1759, and they didn't come to North America. Munro would serve his entire military service in the 35th Regiment of Foot, and it would be that regiment, of course, that would garrison Fort William Henry, along with the 60th Regiment and some provincial regiments during the siege.
Immediately before coming to Fort William Henry, where was Munro stationed?
He would have been in Ireland, the 35th. It was on what they called the Irish Establishment. So what happened was, before they shipped to England in preparation to come to North America, they transformed their unit into a stronger, augmented unit strength-wise by taking people out of some of the other Irish regiments. Then they went to England and they further augmented them by taking convicts who were in the prisons for life sentences and said, if you want to be in the Army for life, you can join the 35th. And the other way they did it was the famous impressment.
So no one in the War Department said, let's send Munro over because he's a great commander.
No, because in fact he had never seen active military combat prior to coming here and facing the siege at Fort William Henry. He had no active combat experience at all.
And he had never served under General Webb at all?
Not to my knowledge. But Webb did come over with him on the same transports that brought the 35th over here, and so did the 42nd Highland Regiment came over at the same time, which is later known, of course, as the Black Watch.
Now, did he have any discretion? Did he have orders say, don't leave that fort when they know Montcalm is coming?
Webb was to the fort a couple days before the siege actually started. And when he got there, he was with his engineer, Montresor, and they discovered that the 35th wasn't encamped in what they considered a secure location, and that's what prompted the retrenchment breastwork to be made over where Lake George Battlefield Park is now. And that's where Munro and Colonel Young of the Royal Americans was over there with Munro. The fort was left in command of John Ormsby, who was of the 35th Regiment. They weren't experienced with their weapons, and that's why they were put on the frontier, actually, and up here, because Loudon was under the opinion nothing was going to happen here. What had happened was a Rogers Ranger sergeant had escaped that had been a prisoner, told the intelligence to Loudon that all the French were heading to Quebec to defend Quebec because they were aware Loudon was planning to go take Louisbourg. He takes all the good regiments to Louisbourg and he leaves his regiments he thinks that are substandard here, and consequently Montcalm took advantage of that vulnerability.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Rogers Rangers. Do you think that would have been a factor at all in this campaign if Rogers had been left on Lake George to scout it out versus I think they used the New Jersey Blues instead for scouting, which is kind of absurd. But do you think that would have any effect on what happened?
Well, Putnam was here. He wasn't a Rogers Ranger.
Yes, you're correct.
He was a Connecticut officer, but he did serve as a ranger for them, and he went out on scouts with Rogers as a volunteer. But I don't know if they would have really made a contribution. And, of course, Loudon took Rogers with him to take Louisbourg, which, of course, I should mention that expedition was a failure, never even happened. They got there at Halifax, and that was the end of that.
Well, thank you very much, George. This has been enlightening for our listeners because Colonel Munro is a person, his name comes up in The Last of the Mohegans, but we don't know a lot about him. We appreciate all the work that you've done on Colonel Munro, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on Lake George Radio, 93.5 FM, and live streaming at lakegeorgeradio.com. If you have any questions regarding Lake George Battlefield Moments, email info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org. And tune in every Saturday morning at 9:45 for Lake George Battlefield Moments.